Hey friend, welcome to Sleepy History World. Before we begin tonight's journey, if this channel becomes a place you enjoy returning to, a quiet corner where slow storytelling helps you relax after a long day, I'd truly appreciate it if you took a moment to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you peaceful history stories to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights if you can, and let the outside world slowly fade away. Tonight, we're stepping behind the closed doors of one of the most famous royal courts in history. Millions have admired Queen Elizabeth I through magnificent portraits filled with pearls, dazzling gowns, and symbols of power. But almost no one saw what happened when the crowds disappeared. The ceremonies ended and the palace grew quiet. What was England's greatest queen really like during an ordinary evening meal? Did she feast like the legends suggest, or were her private dinners far more modest? What conversations echoed around her table? Which foods did she quietly enjoy? And what secrets did her loyal servants witness as they stood only a few feet away? For the next little while, we'll leave the grand throne room behind and enter the peaceful candlelit chambers where history unfolded one quiet supper at a time. Together, we'll discover the hidden routines, surprising habits, and fascinating details that her closest attendants observed, but that rarely appeared in official records. So settle in, take a slow, deep breath, and let's gently step back more than 400 years to discover what Queen Elizabeth I's servants truly saw at her private table. Imagine serving Queen Elizabeth I not from the glittering distance of a royal ceremony, but from only a few feet away, close enough to hear the soft scrape of a silver knife across a plate, the rustle of embroidered silk as she shifted in her chair, and the quiet murmur of trusted attendants waiting for the slightest signal, for the servants assigned to the Queen's private table. Every meal offered a rare glimpse behind the carefully constructed image of England's famous Virgin Queen. Public portraits showed a ruler wrapped in jewels, pearls, and dazzling gowns, but those who carried her dishes, poured her wine, and stood silently against the walls witnessed something far more personal. They saw habits, preferences, moods, and routines that rarely appeared in official records. Even in private, however, Elizabeth remained unmistakably a monarch. Every action around her table reflected rank, ceremony, and caution, reminding everyone present that although the room was smaller and quieter than the great banquet halls, the Queen was never simply an ordinary woman enjoying dinner. A private meal in the royal apartments began long before Elizabeth entered the room. Servants carefully arranged polished silver dishes, fine linen, and beautifully crafted cups upon a table that appeared simple by royal standards, but still surpassed the homes of almost every noble family in England. Each object had been inspected for cleanliness and safety. Food intended for the Queen passed through a carefully controlled system where trusted officials supervised preparation. Fear of poisoning was never far from royal minds during the 16th century. Political conspiracies, religious conflicts, and rival claimants to the throne created genuine dangers. So the Queen's household followed strict procedures to reduce every possible risk. Selected servants handled her food, and official tasters sampled certain dishes before they reached Elizabeth's table. Watching this process reminded everyone that even the act of eating carried political significance for England's ruler. When Elizabeth finally arrived, servants often noticed how different she appeared from the majestic figure seen during public ceremonies. Although still elegantly dressed, her clothing might be slightly less elaborate than the magnificent gowns displayed before ambassadors or parliament. Yet even her simpler garments contained rich fabrics, delicate embroidery, and carefully chosen jewels. The Queen understood the power of appearance better than almost anyone of her age. Every ribbon, necklace, and sleeve contributed to the image of strength, wealth, and authority that surrounded her. Servants learned never to stare openly, but many later remembered the remarkable whiteness of her face, created with fashionable cosmetics, and the vivid contrast between her pale complexion and her brilliantly coloured dresses. Elizabeth rarely ate enormous portions despite the abundance placed before her. The royal kitchen prepared many dishes, but the Queen usually sampled only a selection. Her meals reflected both personal taste and the seasonal availability of ingredients. Fresh fish appeared frequently, especially during religious fasting days, when meat was avoided according to custom. Roasted game, beef, mutton, poultry, and venison were common when permitted. Bread accompanied nearly every meal, while cheeses, fruits, herbs, and vegetables completed the table. Imported luxuries such as oranges, lemons, figs, almonds, sugar, and spices demonstrated England's growing connections with international trade. To modernize, the quantity of food might seem excessive, yet much of it symbolized royal prosperity rather than personal appetite. Servants observed that the Queen often preferred foods prepared with care rather than overwhelming richness. Contemporary accounts suggest she enjoyed roasted meats, game birds, sweet pastries, and certain fruits, especially when they were fresh and perfectly ripe. She also appreciated elaborate sugar creations that amazed visitors during special occasions. Sugar remained an expensive luxury, imported over great distances, making sweet dishes a visible sign of wealth. At quieter private meals, these extravagant displays were less common, but carefully prepared desserts still reflected the refinement expected within the royal household. Drinking formed another carefully managed part of the meal. Clean water was not always trusted in 16th century England, so wine, ale, and lightly fermented beverages frequently appeared on noble tables. Elizabeth herself often drank diluted wine, served in elegant cups handled by trusted attendants. Every movement surrounding the cup followed established routines. A servant approached respectfully, presented the drink, and withdrew without unnecessary conversation. Such choreography had been practiced countless times, because mistakes in the Queen's presence could damage a servant's reputation or career. Conversation at the private table could be surprisingly lively. Elizabeth possessed an exceptional education unusual even among European rulers. Fluent in several languages and deeply interested in history, theology, literature, and politics, she enjoyed intelligent discussion. Trusted courtiers sometimes entertained her with stories from court, reports from abroad, or thoughtful debate. Servants standing nearby overheard fragments of conversations touching upon foreign ambassadors, naval ventures, marriage negotiations, theatrical performances, or religious affairs. Yet discretion formed an unwritten rule of survival. Household staff who repeated private conversations outside the royal apartments risked severe punishment. Silence became one of the most valuable skills a servant could possess. The Queen's sense of humour occasionally surprised those who expected constant formality. She could laugh warmly at clever jokes, playful remarks, or amusing stories offered by favourites at court. Witnesses described moments when Elizabeth teased her attendants or exchanged witty comments with trusted companions. Her intelligence often appeared through sharp observations delivered with remarkable speed. Servants learned to remain expressionless unless invited to respond, but many undoubtedly appreciated these lighter moments that revealed a more human side of their formidable mistress. Not every meal unfolded peacefully. Elizabeth's moods could change quickly, especially during periods of political tension or personal disappointment. A troubling letter from abroad, news of rebellion, disappointing military reports, or disputes among courtiers sometimes reached her shortly before dinner. On such occasions, servants noticed shorter conversations, untouched dishes, or longer silences. The Queen might push aside a favourite meal after only a few bites while continuing to think about matters of state. Even at her private table, England's government remained close at hand. Secretaries occasionally arrived carrying documents requiring immediate attention. Meals paused while Elizabeth read reports, signed papers, or dictated instructions. To the servants watching quietly, it became clear that ruling a kingdom allowed very little separation between personal life and public duty. One unknown detail that fascinated observers involved the extraordinary order maintained around the Queen. Every servant knew precisely where to stand, when to move, and how deeply to bow. Plates disappeared almost silently before new dishes arrived. Napkins were replaced when necessary. Candles were adjusted without interrupting conversation. The success of a royal meal depended upon dozens of nearly invisible actions performed with remarkable precision. Experienced servants trained newcomers patiently, because even small errors became highly visible within such carefully controlled surroundings. Elizabeth also paid attention to presentation. Dishes often arrived decorated with herbs, flowers considered safe for culinary use, or artistic arrangements reflecting Renaissance tastes. Wealthy households admired visual beauty alongside flavour, and the royal kitchen employed skilled cooks capable of producing impressive displays. Although private meals were less theatrical than grand feasts celebrating diplomatic victories or royal holidays, elegance remained important. The Queen appreciated refinement and expected standards worthy of her position. Animals occasionally wandered through parts of Tudor palaces, but the Queen's immediate dining area remained carefully controlled. Small lapdogs associated with noblewomen sometimes appeared near royal apartments, though they were not permitted to disrupt formal service. Servants occasionally noticed Elizabeth showing affection toward favourite pets during quieter moments away from large audiences. Such brief glimpses reminded them that beneath the layers of ceremony lived a woman capable of ordinary affection, despite carrying extraordinary responsibilities. Music sometimes accompanied private dining, though not constantly. Skilled musicians employed by the royal household performed gentle pieces using lutes, viols, or keyboards during selected occasions. Elizabeth herself possessed musical ability and appreciated fine performances. Soft melodies drifting through nearby chambers created an atmosphere very different from the louder entertainment accompanying great public banquets. Servants moving carefully around the table often completed their duties, while elegant music floated quietly through the palace corridors. Seasonal changes influenced what appeared before the Queen. Spring brought fresh herbs and early vegetables. Summer offered berries, cherries, and other fruits from royal gardens. Autumn produced apples, pears, nuts, and game from hunting estates. Winter relied more heavily upon preserved foods, salted meats, dried fruits, and imported luxuries capable of surviving long journeys. As the years passed, the servants who remained in Elizabeth's household became remarkably skilled at reading the Queen without hearing a single word. A slight pause before lifting a cup, a longer glance toward the window, or the way she folded her hands after finishing a course could quietly reveal whether she was pleased, worried, or deep in thought. New servants often focused on the glitter of the jewels or the richness of the food, but veterans understood that the smallest gestures mattered far more. They learned that when Elizabeth leaned back in her chair and smiled faintly, conversation was likely to continue. If she remained unusually still, with her eyes fixed on the table rather than the people around her, everyone instinctively became quieter. No formal order needed to be spoken. Years of experience had taught the household to recognize the rhythm of the Queen's moods. One feature of the private table that surprised many newcomers was the remarkable absence of wasteful noise. Despite the large number of attendants nearby, very little could be heard beyond the gentle clink of silver, the crackle of a nearby fireplace during colder months, and the occasional footsteps of servants crossing polished wooden floors. Orders were often communicated with discreet gestures, rather than loud commands. A raised finger could summon another dish. A slight movement of the hand might mean the Queen wished for more wine, while a simple nod could dismiss an entire course. The servants moved almost like dancers following a familiar performance, each knowing exactly when to step forward and when to disappear into the background. The aromas drifting through the chamber changed with every course. Fresh rosemary, thyme, sage, parsley, and mint often scented the air before the dishes even reached the table. These herbs were valued not only for flavour, but also because many people believed they promoted health and aided digestion. Cinnamon, cloves, ginger, nutmeg, mace, and pepper added warmth and richness to noble meals. Although such spices remained expensive imports, their presence reminded everyone of England's growing trade with distant lands. For a servant carrying a steaming platter, the fragrance alone revealed whether the kitchen had prepared roasted venison, baked fish, spiced pies, or sweet custards long before the silver lids were lifted. Lighting transformed the atmosphere as evening approached. During daylight, sunlight filtered through tall windows, softened by heavy curtains and coloured glass. After sunset, dozens of candles illuminated the room with a warm golden glow that danced across polished silverware and jewelled clothing. Shadows flickered against carved wooden walls, making embroidered fabrics shimmer with every movement. Servants carrying candles learned to protect the flames from sudden draughts, while ensuring enough light reached the Queen's table without filling the chamber with smoke. The changing light gave even familiar rooms a different personality from one season to the next. Although Elizabeth's private dining room was quieter than the great halls used for public feasts, reminders of royal authority remained everywhere. Guards stood outside nearby doors. Gentlemen of the chamber waited discreetly within reach, and trusted ladies attended the Queen throughout the meal. No visitor simply wandered into the room without permission. Every person present had a clearly defined role. Even among the servants there existed a strict hierarchy. Senior officers supervised valuable plate, younger attendants carried dishes, while specialized officials managed wine, linens, or ceremonial objects. The smooth functioning of the meal depended upon this invisible chain of responsibility. The Queen herself sometimes surprised those around her with her remarkable memory. She could remember a conversation from weeks earlier or ask about a matter discussed during a previous meal. A servant who had performed exceptionally well might receive a brief word of praise months later, while repeated carelessness was equally unlikely to be forgotten. Elizabeth had spent decades navigating the dangers of court life, and her sharp memory helped her judge the reliability of those around her. Household staff quickly realized that consistency mattered more than occasional brilliance. Weather often influenced the mood within the royal apartments. On stormy evenings, rain beat against the palace windows, while servants hurried through covered passages carrying freshly prepared food from distant kitchens. Fires burned brightly in large hearths, filling the room with comforting warmth and the faint scent of burning oak. During especially cold winters, hot dishes reached the Queen under covered plates to preserve their heat for as long as possible. In contrast, warm summer afternoons encouraged lighter meals, open windows, and fresh flowers gathered from palace gardens. The changing seasons quietly shaped daily life, even within the luxurious surroundings of the Tudor court. Servants also noticed that Elizabeth rarely rushed through her meals. Eating formed only one part of a larger social and political routine. While taking small portions from carefully selected dishes, she often listened more than she spoke. Courtiers sometimes presented news gathered from London, foreign ambassadors, or the English countryside. Reports of poor harvests, naval preparations, disputes among noble families, and developments across Europe occasionally entered the conversation. Decisions affecting thousands of people could begin as quiet discussions over dinner before later becoming official policy. For the attendants standing silently nearby, these ordinary-looking meals sometimes became front-row seats to history unfolding in real time. Occasionally, the Queen requested entertainment during or after dining. A gentle song performed by one of the royal musicians, a beautifully recited poem, or a short reading from a classical text could provide pleasant diversion after hours devoted to affairs of state. Elizabeth greatly admired learning and frequently encouraged educated conversation. She expected wit rather than foolish flattery. Those fortunate enough to entertain her successfully earned both admiration and influence, while those whose jokes fell flat quickly discovered that royal patience had limits. Another detail servants quietly observed involved the Queen's remarkable self-control. Even when meals included rich desserts, elaborate pastries, and luxurious imported sweets, Elizabeth generally avoided excessive indulgence. She sampled what pleased her but seldom appeared, driven by appetite alone. Maintaining dignity remained part of her identity. Every action reflected the discipline expected from someone who had spent nearly her entire adult life under public observation. Even in private, old habits of caution and restraint rarely disappeared. Letters frequently interrupted the peaceful rhythm of dinner. A messenger might arrive carrying sealed correspondence marked with the royal insignia, or bearing urgent news from abroad. Upon receiving such letters, Elizabeth sometimes laid down her knife immediately and read them without delay. The room would fall completely silent. Servants stood motionless, unsure whether the message contained good news or warning of fresh danger. A slight smile might ease everyone's tension, while a thoughtful expression often meant further meetings with advisors would continue long into the night. Once the letter had been set aside, the meal resumed almost as though nothing had happened. Yet everyone understood that the fate of kingdoms could change between one course and the next. The Queen also maintained certain personal comforts that regular servants gradually came to recognize. She appreciated fresh flowers when available, enjoyed pleasant fragrances within her chambers, and preferred surroundings that reflected cleanliness and order. Sweet-smelling herbs such as lavender and rosemary sometimes appeared in the room, not only because they were attractive, but also because many people believed they purified the air. During an age when unpleasant odors were associated with disease, maintaining a fresh environment formed part of both comfort and health. As Elizabeth grew older, some servants noticed subtle changes in her daily routine. Meals occasionally became shorter, and she relied more heavily upon trusted companions who had served her faithfully for many years. The energy that had once carried her through endless ceremonies gradually gave way to quieter evenings within her private apartments. Yet even in advancing age, the Queen remained intensely aware of her public image. Before appearing before visitors, she carefully prepared her appearance, ensuring that age never overshadowed the dignity of the crown. Those privileged enough to witness both the private and public sides of Elizabeth understood how much effort was required to maintain the image that history would remember. Perhaps the most striking sight at the Queen's private table was not the glittering silver, the richly embroidered tablecloths, or the abundance of carefully prepared food. It was the extraordinary discipline shared by everyone in the room. Dozens of people worked together so seamlessly that the meal appeared effortless. Yet behind every graceful movement stood years of training, strict etiquette, and unwavering loyalty. The servants understood that they were participating in something greater than dinner. Every plate carried to the table, every goblet polished to perfection, and every silent bow contributed to preserving the dignity of the English monarchy. When the candles finally burned lower and the evening meal came to an end, the Queen would rise, and every person present instinctively stepped back. There were moments when the Queen ate in almost complete silence, and these were often the occasions her servants remembered most clearly. Silence did not necessarily mean displeasure. Elizabeth had spent her life surrounded by petitions, debates, reports, and endless conversation. A quiet meal could offer one of the few opportunities to think without interruption. While the room remained still, she might gaze into the fire or toward the tall windows overlooking palace courtyards, appearing to focus on something far beyond the walls around her. The attendants never knew whether she was considering the latest message from Scotland, reflecting on Parliament, or simply enjoying a rare moment of peace. Whatever occupied her thoughts, no one dared disturb them unless absolutely necessary. The Queen had an extraordinary ability to make everyone in the room aware of her presence without raising her voice. Servants later recalled that Elizabeth seldom needed to shout. A calm request spoken in a measured tone often carried more authority than the loudest command. Even experienced household officers straightened their posture when she entered. The room itself seemed to change as conversation softened and movements became more deliberate. This quiet authority had been cultivated over decades. Elizabeth understood that confidence often spoke louder than force, and those serving her table witnessed this lesson every single day. Among the many dishes brought before her were beautifully baked pies that concealed richly seasoned meats beneath carefully crafted pastry. Some pies contained venison from royal parks, while others held pigeon, rabbit, or game birds depending on the season. Fish pies appeared regularly during fasting periods, flavoured with herbs and spices that filled the chamber with a comforting aroma. When the crust was cut open, fragrant steam drifted upward, carrying scents of pepper, cloves, parsley and butter throughout the room. For hungry servants who had been working since before sunrise, the smell alone was enough to test their discipline, yet not a single expression betrayed their thoughts. Fresh bread arrived several times during the meal, its crust crisp from the ovens and its interior soft and warm. Bread was far more than a simple accompaniment. It reflected the quality of the household itself. The finest white loaves, baked from carefully sifted flour, appeared at the Queen's table, while darker breads were served to lower-ranking members of the household. Even this ordinary staple reminded everyone that Tudor society was built upon strict distinctions of status. A servant could judge a person's rank simply by observing the bread placed before them. Fruit often appeared toward the end of the meal, carefully arranged rather than casually piled. Bright red apples, ripe pears, sweet cherries during summer, and clusters of grapes were displayed with almost artistic care. Imported oranges and lemons, still considered luxuries in England, occasionally added brilliant splashes of colour to the table. These fruits were admired as much for their rarity as for their taste. Some visitors had never even seen such exotic produce before entering the royal court. To Elizabeth's servants, however, these displays became familiar reminders that the Queen's table represented the wealth and reach of an expanding kingdom. One of the more curious sights involved the elaborate napkins folded into decorative shapes before each meal. Skilled household workers transformed simple linen into elegant designs that reflected Renaissance tastes, while modern diners might overlook such details. 16th century nobles appreciated refined presentation as evidence of a well-managed household. The servants responsible for these linens took great pride in their work, knowing that untidy presentation reflected poorly upon the officers supervising the Queen's apartments. The Queen herself showed genuine appreciation for craftsmanship, whether examining a finely engraved silver cup, admiring delicate embroidery on a tablecloth, or commenting on the workmanship of an imported ceramic vessel. Elizabeth possessed an eye for quality. Years of ruling had exposed her to the finest artisans in Europe, and she developed strong opinions about beauty, elegance, and design. Servants occasionally overheard her praising a particularly well-made object, and such compliments spread quickly through the household, bringing quiet satisfaction to those whose efforts usually remained unnoticed. At times, members of the royal household presented small gifts during or shortly after meals. These might include rare fruits from a nobleman's estate, beautifully bound books, embroidered gloves, delicate jewellery, or unusual items acquired through foreign trade. Elizabeth examined such gifts with careful interest. She understood that presents often carried political meaning alongside personal goodwill. A beautifully crafted object might represent an alliance, a request for royal favour, or an expression of loyalty. Even the simple act of accepting a gift involved diplomacy, and servants standing nearby witnessed how gracefully the Queen balanced courtesy with caution. No matter how private the meal appeared, there was always the possibility that a distinguished visitor might be admitted unexpectedly. A trusted counsellor, a respected noblewoman, or a foreign ambassador bearing urgent news could be invited into the chamber with little warning. Servants adapted instantly, adding another chair, bringing fresh dishes, and adjusting the service without disrupting the calm atmosphere. Their efficiency reflected countless hours of training. To outside observers, it seemed effortless. But every graceful movement had been rehearsed through years of experience. The Queen's remarkable education occasionally revealed itself in unexpected ways. While tasting a dish prepared with herbs from the royal gardens, she might discuss their classical names or mention how ancient Roman writers described similar meals. A simple conversation about fruit could lead to references from Greek history or passages from Latin authors she had studied in her youth. Elizabeth's servants could not always follow these scholarly discussions, yet they recognized that their mistress possessed an unusually curious mind. Meals became opportunities not only for nourishment, but also for learning, reflection, and intellectual exchange. The atmosphere changed noticeably whenever children from noble families visited the court. Their youthful curiosity sometimes contrasted with the careful restraint of experienced courtiers. Elizabeth often displayed surprising patience toward well-behaved children, asking gentle questions or smiling at their nervous attempts to observe proper etiquette. Servants who had grown accustomed to the serious business of government quietly appreciated these lighter moments, which briefly softened the formal atmosphere surrounding the Queen. The palace cats occasionally attracted the attention of household staff more than the Queen herself. They prowled storerooms and kitchens in search of mice, serving a practical purpose in protecting valuable food supplies. Although they rarely entered the Queen's immediate dining chamber, servants were well acquainted with these quiet hunters. Their presence reflected the realities of palace life, where even magnificent royal residences required constant vigilance against pests. Such ordinary details reminded everyone that behind the grandeur lay the practical work of maintaining an enormous household. As evening progressed, the candles gradually shortened, their wax dripping slowly into polished holders. Servants replaced them so discreetly that conversation scarcely paused. The gentle scent of melted beeswax mixed with the aromas of roasted meats, fresh herbs, and burning oak from the fireplace. Outside, darkness settled over the palace courtyards, while inside the chamber remained warm, bright, and orderly. These peaceful evenings stood in sharp contrast to the political uncertainty beyond the palace walls, where religious conflict, foreign threats, and court rivalries constantly shaped the kingdom's future. Those who served Elizabeth's private table also became witnesses to the passing of time itself. They watched familiar faces disappear from the court through retirement, illness, or death, while younger servants arrived to take their places. New fashions gradually replaced old ones. Tableware evolved, recipes changed, and foreign goods became increasingly common as England expanded its trade. Yet through all these changes, one constant remained. At the head of the table sat the Queen, maintaining the same careful dignity that had defined her reign for decades. Many years later, when Elizabeth's reign had become history, surviving members of the royal household undoubtedly remembered these quiet meals more vividly than the grand ceremonies witnessed by thousands. Public spectacles displayed the majesty of the English crown, but the private table revealed something far rarer. Here they saw a monarch who balanced immense responsibility with ordinary human routine, who listened more than she spoke, who appreciated fine craftsmanship, who valued loyalty above flattery, and who carried the burdens of an entire kingdom, even while sharing what appeared to be a simple evening meal. To stand beside that table was to witness history, not in moments of dramatic triumph or crisis, but in the quiet rituals repeated day after day, where the true character of one of England's greatest queens revealed itself in the smallest and most ordinary details. For the youngest servants entering the royal household, the Queen's private table became an education unlike any they could have imagined. Many arrived from respectable families with little understanding of the extraordinary discipline required inside a Tudor palace. During their first weeks, they were taught how to bow correctly, how to approach the Queen without turning their backs too suddenly, how to carry delicate silver vessels with steady hands, and even how to walk across polished floors without making unnecessary noise. Older attendants corrected the smallest mistakes immediately, explaining that in the Queen's presence every movement reflected the honour of the royal household. Over time, these careful routines became second nature, until even the newest servant moved with quiet confidence. The Queen occasionally noticed unfamiliar faces among her attendants, although surrounded by hundreds of household officers throughout her reign. Elizabeth possessed an impressive awareness of the people serving nearby. A nervous young page struggling to conceal trembling hands might receive a reassuring glance rather than a harsh rebuke. Experienced servants later remarked that the Queen understood how intimidating her presence could be. While she expected excellence, she also recognized genuine effort. Such moments of unexpected kindness remained treasured memories for those fortunate enough to experience them. Winter evenings created an especially memorable atmosphere around the private table. Thick stone walls kept out much of the bitter cold, while roaring fireplaces filled the chamber with comforting warmth. Heavy tapestries hanging from the walls not only displayed scenes from mythology and history, but also helped insulate the rooms against icy draughts. Outside, frost sometimes covered palace gardens, and servants crossing courtyards hurried beneath cloaks while carrying covered dishes from the kitchens. Once inside the Queen's apartments, however, the glow of candlelight reflecting from polished silver created a sense of quiet comfort that contrasted sharply with the harsh weather beyond the windows. In the warmer months, palace gardens provided more than beautiful views. Fresh herbs, edible flowers, lettuces, peas, beans, and fruits harvested that very morning often appeared on the Queen's table by evening. Gardeners took immense pride in supplying produce worthy of the monarch, carefully selecting the finest examples before sending them to the kitchens. Servants delivering these dishes sometimes recognized vegetables they had watched growing only days earlier. Such freshness represented a luxury unavailable to most ordinary households, where seasonal shortages often determined daily meals. Elizabeth had a lifelong appreciation for moderation in conversation as well as in eating. She disliked excessive boasting and had little patience for endless compliments that lacked sincerity. Courtiers quickly learned that clever observations, thoughtful questions, or genuinely amusing stories pleased her far more than exaggerated flattery. Those serving the table observed this repeatedly. A witty exchange could brighten the Queen's mood for the remainder of the evening, while insincere praise often met with little more than polite acknowledgement before the conversation moved elsewhere. The careful handling of the Queen's personal tableware reflected another layer of royal ceremony. Certain cups, plates, and serving pieces were reserved exclusively for Elizabeth's use. After each meal, they were cleaned with exceptional care inspected for damage, counted by responsible officers, and stored securely until needed again. These objects were not merely valuable possessions, but symbols of royal authority. Losing or damaging them carried serious consequences, making the officers responsible among the most trusted members of the household. Servants also became familiar with the Queen's preference for cleanliness. Hands were washed before important meals, linens were changed frequently, and dining vessels received careful attention. Although Tudor standards differed greatly from modern expectations, Elizabeth's household generally maintained higher levels of cleanliness than many contemporary noble residences. The Queen valued order, and this preference extended from the arrangement of her chambers to the presentation of every meal placed before her. Occasionally, unusual foods arrived from distant regions as diplomatic gifts or rare purchases from merchants. Exotic citrus fruits, unfamiliar spices, preserved delicacies, or sweet confections from continental Europe sometimes appeared on the private table. Elizabeth examined such novelties with curiosity rather than excitement. She appreciated fine things, but rarely allowed herself to appear overly impressed by luxury. Her composed manner reminded everyone present that a queen should receive even the rarest treasures with calm dignity rather than childish delight. The palace clock, where one could be heard, quietly marked the passing hours throughout the evening. Servants measured time not only by bells but also by routine. They knew almost instinctively when fresh candles would be required, when additional wine might be requested, and when the Queen was likely preparing to conclude the meal. This remarkable sense of timing came only after years of experience. Visitors often noticed the elegance of royal service without realizing how much practice lay behind its effortless appearance. Sometimes Elizabeth reflected aloud on changes she had witnessed during her reign. She had ruled through decades of remarkable transformation, seeing England's navy grow stronger, overseas exploration expand, and religious conflicts reshape the nation. Although such reflections were usually brief, servants standing nearby recognized that they were listening to someone who had personally experienced many of the events future generations would study in history books. These quiet remarks, spoken over an evening meal rather than from a royal throne, carried a special intimacy that public speeches could never match. As the Queen advanced into old age, familiar attendants became almost like silent companions. They knew which chair she preferred, how she liked certain dishes presented, and when she wished for conversation or quiet reflection. Elizabeth, in turn, trusted many of these individuals because they had served faithfully for years without betraying the privacy of her household. Such loyalty formed the foundation of daily life within the palace. In a world filled with political intrigue and shifting alliances, dependable service became one of the greatest comforts available to an aging monarch. Visitors fortunate enough to glimpse the Queen's private dining arrangements often expected overwhelming extravagance. Instead, they frequently encountered an atmosphere defined more by refinement than excess. Certainly the silver, fine fabrics, imported delicacies, and elegant furnishings surpassed anything owned by ordinary people. Yet the room itself remained surprisingly restrained compared with the immense spectacle of state banquets. Elizabeth understood that true magnificence did not require constant display. The greatest luxury at her private table was not endless abundance but perfect order, impeccable service, and complete confidence that every detail had been carefully arranged. When the evening finally ended, servants extinguished the last candles, leaving only the faint glow of dying embers in the fireplace. Outside, the palace settled into nighttime silence, broken only by the distant footsteps of guards beginning their watches and the occasional sound of wind moving through ancient stone courtyards. The Queen retired to her private chambers, carrying with her the responsibilities that never truly disappeared, even during sleep. Meanwhile, the attendants quietly completed their final duties before preparing to repeat the same carefully choreographed routine the following day. Years later, long after Elizabeth's reign had passed into history, the memories held by those servants would have been unlike the dramatic tales told by soldiers or ambassadors. They remembered the warmth of candlelight reflecting from polished silver, the scent of rosemary rising from freshly carved meat, the soft rustle of silk gowns as the Queen reached for her cup, the thoughtful silence that sometimes settled over the table, and the quiet dignity with which England's most famous monarch carried herself through the simplest moments of daily life. While the world remembered Elizabeth I for defeating mighty enemies, encouraging exploration, and guiding England through an extraordinary age, her servants remembered something equally remarkable. They remembered a woman who transformed even the ordinary act of sharing an evening meal into a lesson in grace, discipline, intelligence, and enduring royal authority, leaving behind not only a powerful kingdom, but also countless quiet moments that revealed the true character of the Queen behind the crown. Beyond the final course and the clearing of the table, the evening did not simply end. For the servants closest to Elizabeth, the quiet hours that followed dinner were often just as revealing as the meal itself. The Queen sometimes remained seated for several minutes, her hands resting lightly upon the carved arms of her chair as she gathered her thoughts. The room became almost perfectly still. No one hurried her. Courtiers waited patiently. Ladies, in waiting, stood with practiced grace, and servants remained motionless beside the walls. It was during these lingering moments that Elizabeth appeared least like the commanding figure immortalized in portraits, and most like a thoughtful ruler carrying decades of responsibility upon her shoulders. The silence was never uncomfortable. Instead, it carried the weight of a woman who had spent nearly her entire life making decisions that shaped the fate of a nation. Only after the Queen rose did the carefully rehearsed machinery of the royal household spring back into motion. A lady stepped forward to accompany her. A gentleman opened the door, and attendants quietly followed at a respectful distance. Within moments, the chamber that had served as the centre of England's government over supper became an ordinary room once again. Servants folded the linen with astonishing precision, ensuring every crease lay perfectly flat before it was returned to the household stores. Silver plates were counted not once but several times. Cups bearing the royal arms were polished until they reflected the candlelight like mirrors. Nothing was left to chance, for every object belonged not merely to Elizabeth herself, but to the English crown. Older members of the household occasionally spoke in hushed voices about how much the Queen's habits had changed since her youth. Those who had served her for decades remembered a more energetic monarch who could dance for hours, ride horses with confidence, and remain awake long into the night discussing politics, poetry, or foreign affairs. Age had naturally slowed some of those activities, yet it had not diminished her sharp mind. Even in her later years, servants noticed that Elizabeth rarely missed small details. She could remember where an object normally stood upon the table, or notice if a familiar attendant had been absent for several days. Such observations reminded everyone that the Queen's attention remained remarkably keen despite advancing age. The walls surrounding the private dining chamber had witnessed countless conversations that history would never record. Not every discussion involved wars or diplomacy. Sometimes the Queen asked after the health of a trusted servant who had fallen ill. On other evenings, she inquired about repairs to a palace roof, damaged during a storm, or admired flowers blooming unusually early in the gardens. These ordinary conversations revealed the practical side of monarchy. A kingdom consisted not only of treaties and battles, but also of households, buildings, gardens, kitchens, and the hundreds of people whose daily work allowed royal life to function smoothly. Many servants secretly admired the Queen's remarkable endurance. Before reaching her private table, Elizabeth had often spent the entire day receiving ambassadors, reviewing official papers, attending religious services, meeting councillors, hearing petitions, and participating in court ceremonies. Hours of standing in richly embroidered gowns, heavy with pearls and jewels, demanded considerable stamina. Yet when she entered the dining chamber, she rarely allowed exhaustion to dominate her expression. Her composure itself became a form of leadership. Those around her understood that if the Queen appeared calm, then the kingdom itself appeared stable. Occasionally, laughter echoed unexpectedly through the room. Elizabeth enjoyed clever wordplay and possessed a famously quick wit. A well-timed remark from a trusted courtier, or an amusing misunderstanding, could draw genuine laughter from the Queen, briefly dissolving the formal atmosphere surrounding the table. Such moments often surprised new servants who had expected constant solemnity. The older attendants, however, understood that humour formed part of Elizabeth's personality. It offered welcome relief from the endless pressures of government, while strengthening the loyalty of those fortunate enough to share these private moments. During especially quiet evenings, the Queen sometimes requested that a book be brought to her after the meal. Rather than retiring immediately, she might spend time reading passages from classical authors, religious writings, or recent translations that interested her. Elizabeth had been educated to an exceptional standard and never lost her love of learning. Servants entering the chamber with additional candles occasionally caught sight of the Queen, absorbed in a page of Latin or Greek, reading with the same concentration she devoted to matters of state. Even after decades upon the throne, curiosity remained one of her defining qualities. The changing fashions of the court were also reflected around the private table. Servants witnessed sleeves becoming wider or narrower, collars rising into elaborate ruffs, fabrics growing increasingly luxurious, and jewellery becoming ever more intricate. Yet amid these changing styles, Elizabeth maintained a distinct sense of personal presentation. She understood that clothing communicated power long before a single word was spoken. Even at relatively private meals, every carefully chosen garment reinforced the dignity of the monarchy. The Queen's private apartments carried familiar scents that returning servants associated with comfort and routine. Beeswax candles filled the air with a gentle sweetness, while polished oak furniture released its warm, woody fragrance. Fresh herbs placed in bowls added notes of rosemary and lavender, and the nearby fireplaces contributed the unmistakable smell of seasoned logs burning steadily through the evening. Together these scents created an atmosphere far removed from the crowded streets of London outside the palace walls. For those who spent years in royal service, these familiar aromas became inseparable from memories of Elizabeth herself. There were evenings when rain tapped softly against the windows throughout the entire meal. The sound blended with the quiet crackling of the fire and the faint clinking of silverware, creating an atmosphere almost peaceful, despite the political uncertainty beyond the palace. Messengers still arrived, ships still crossed dangerous seas, and distant kingdoms still negotiated alliances. But within those stone walls, the Queen maintained a sense of calm order. Her servants often remarked that Elizabeth possessed the rare ability to prevent the anxieties of the outside world from overwhelming the dignity of her household. The longer a servant remained in royal service, the more clearly they understood that every object at the Queen's table told a story. A silver cup might have been presented by a grateful noble after a military victory. A beautifully embroidered cloth could have been crafted by skilled artisans over many months. Imported spices represented dangerous sea voyages and expanding trade routes. Even the polished wooden table itself had likely stood through years of royal history, witnessing generations of meals before Elizabeth ever took her place there. To outsiders, these were simply fine possessions. To those serving the Queen, they formed part of a living history unfolding one evening at a time. Perhaps the greatest privilege granted to these servants was not the opportunity to stand close to wealth or ceremony, but to witness consistency. Public life often portrayed monarchs through moments of crisis or celebration, yet those who served Elizabeth's private table saw something much deeper. They observed the daily discipline that allowed her to reign successfully for more than 4 decades. They saw the habits repeated without fail, the respect shown to faithful service, the careful attention paid to detail, the patience to listen before speaking, and the determination to preserve dignity even during difficult times. These qualities, practiced quietly at the dinner table rather than proclaimed from a throne, help shape one of the most enduring reigns in English history. When future generations imagined Queen Elizabeth I, they would naturally picture magnificent portraits glittering with pearls, grand speeches delivered before Parliament, or triumphant celebrations following England's greatest achievements. Yet hidden behind those famous images were hundreds of peaceful evenings witnessed only by a handful of loyal servants. They remembered the Queen reaching for a simple piece of bread while discussing affairs of state, pausing to admire the fragrance of fresh herbs gathered from palace gardens, smiling at a witty remark from a trusted companion, or sitting thoughtfully beside a glowing fire after the meal had ended. These quiet scenes never appeared in official paintings, yet they revealed the humanity behind the legend. To the servants who stood silently beside her private table year after year, Elizabeth was not merely England's greatest queen. She was a disciplined ruler, a thoughtful scholar, a gracious hostess, and above all, a woman who carried the immense burden of a crown with unwavering composure until the very end of her remarkable life. As the palace settled into its nightly rhythm, the servants responsible for the Queen's table often reflected on how little of Elizabeth's daily life was ever seen by ordinary people. Most of her subjects knew her only through carefully staged public appearances, official portraits, royal proclamations, or stories carried from one town to another. They imagined endless luxury, constant celebration, and extravagant banquets every evening. Those who stood only a few steps from her chair knew a different reality. They saw that even a queen lived according to routines. Meals arrived at expected hours, Conversations followed the concerns of the day, and the same trusted faces appeared around her year after year. Royal life contained immense privilege, but it was also governed by discipline so strict that almost every hour followed an established pattern. One habit the servants quietly admired was Elizabeth's patience while listening. During private meals, she often allowed others to finish speaking before offering her own opinion. Councillors sometimes presented conflicting advice, each convinced that his recommendation would best serve the kingdom. Rather than interrupting, the Queen frequently listened with remarkable calm, occasionally asking a brief question that revealed she had noticed details others had overlooked. Only after hearing every side would she offer her own thoughts. Watching these discussions taught many attendants that true authority did not always depend upon speaking the most, but upon understanding. The Queen's table also reflected England's changing fortunes during her long reign. When Elizabeth first became Queen in 1558, the kingdom faced financial difficulties and political uncertainty. Decades later, the household enjoyed a wider variety of imported foods than ever before. Fine sugar from overseas plantations, spices brought through expanding trade networks, dried fruits from southern Europe, and wines from distant vineyards gradually became more familiar within the royal kitchens. The servants witnessed these changes not through official announcements, but through the growing diversity of dishes appearing before the Queen. In many ways, the table became a quiet record of England's increasing connections with the wider world. Sometimes unexpected delays occurred before dinner, a messenger arriving breathless from the countryside, a foreign ambassador requesting an urgent audience, or a lengthy council meeting discussing matters of national importance could postpone the evening meal. The kitchens remained ready regardless of changing schedules. Fires were carefully managed so food could be kept warm without being spoiled, while servants waited patiently for word that the Queen was finally on her way. Such interruptions reminded everyone that Elizabeth's personal comfort always came second to the responsibilities of ruling the kingdom. The older ladies who attended the Queen often understood her moods almost as well as the servants did. They had spent countless hours accompanying Elizabeth through triumphs and disappointments alike. During meals, a single glance between the Queen and one of these trusted companions sometimes communicated more than a lengthy conversation. Years of shared experience had created an understanding that required few words. Younger attendants observed these quiet exchanges with admiration, realizing that genuine loyalty was built gradually through decades of faithful service rather than sudden displays of devotion. The Queen also appreciated beautiful craftsmanship in the smallest details. She occasionally paused to examine delicate carvings on a silver salt cellar, or admired the intricate stitching along the edge of a finely woven napkin. Such moments delighted the artisans who had created these objects, even though they were rarely present to witness her admiration firsthand. News of the Queen's approval travelled quickly through the household, eventually reaching the craftsman responsible. A single favourable comment from Elizabeth could become a source of pride remembered for years. Even the pace of the meal reflected the Queen's character. Elizabeth disliked unnecessary haste. Courses were served with careful timing, allowing conversation to develop naturally between them. Servants learned never to rush forward the instant a plate appeared empty. Instead, they watched discreetly, waiting for subtle signals that the Queen had truly finished before removing the dishes. This patience contributed to the calm atmosphere surrounding the table, where every action seemed measured rather than hurried. On evenings following important ceremonies, the contrast between public and private life became especially striking. Only hours earlier, Elizabeth might have worn one of her most magnificent gowns before a crowded audience, dazzling foreign ambassadors with elaborate jewels and regal splendour. By dinner, although still elegantly dressed, she appeared noticeably more relaxed among the familiar faces of her household. The servants recognised this subtle transformation. The Queen never abandoned her dignity, yet within her private apartments she no longer needed to perform quite so consciously for the eyes of Europe. The sounds drifting through the palace after sunset became familiar companions to those serving the evening meal. Somewhere in the distance, musicians might still be practicing for the following day's entertainment. Footsteps echoed faintly along long stone corridors as guards changed their watch. The occasional closing of a heavy wooden door reverberated softly through the building before silence returned. These gentle background sounds blended with the crackling fireplace and quiet conversation around the Queen's table, creating an atmosphere unique to the royal residence after dark. Many servants later realized they had witnessed history without recognizing its significance at the time. A casual conversation over supper about preparations for a voyage, concern regarding events in Ireland, or news from the Netherlands might later prove to have been the beginning of decisions that shaped the course of the kingdom. At the moment, however, these discussions seemed simply part of another evening's routine. Only years later did attendants appreciate that some of England's most important choices had first been considered while the Queen calmly shared an ordinary meal. The royal household valued reliability above all else. A servant who arrived punctually every day, performed each duty carefully, and maintained complete discretion earned greater respect than someone who occasionally impressed but lacked consistency. Elizabeth herself appeared to share this view. Throughout her reign, she rewarded steady loyalty repeatedly. Those who remained faithful through difficult times often discovered that the Queen remembered their service long after others had forgotten it. This quiet appreciation encouraged remarkable devotion among the household staff. The Queen's private dining chamber also reflected the passing years through its furnishings. Chairs required repairs. Tapestries were cleaned or replaced. Silver pieces were occasionally repaired by skilled craftsmen, and wooden furniture developed the smooth finish that comes only from decades of careful use. Servants who had entered the palace as young men or women eventually noticed that the room itself seemed to age alongside them. Yet despite these subtle changes, the evening ritual remained astonishingly familiar, providing a reassuring sense of continuity in an often uncertain world. As Elizabeth's reign entered its final years, those closest to her table became increasingly aware of the enormous legacy she was creating. Without dramatic speeches or public ceremonies, they watched a queen who continued to uphold the same standards she had followed for decades. Every meal reflected order. Every conversation demonstrated careful thought. Every gesture reinforced self-control. Even when age brought greater weariness, the discipline that had defined her reign remained unbroken. To the servants, this constancy became perhaps the Queen's greatest achievement. Long after the candles had been extinguished and the palace corridors had fallen silent, the memory of those evenings remained vivid in the minds of the people who had served there. They remembered the glow of polished silver beneath flickering candlelight, the comforting aroma of roasted meats and fresh herbs, the measured cadence of intelligent conversation, and above all, the quiet presence of a monarch who never forgot that every private action reflected upon the crown. While history would celebrate Elizabeth I for defeating enemies, strengthening England, and inspiring an age that bore her name, the servants who stood beside her private table carried a different memory. They remembered not only the Queen of England, but the woman who faced each ordinary evening with the same grace, discipline, curiosity, and unwavering sense of duty that had guided one of the most remarkable reigns in British history. There were also evenings when the Queen's table became a place of quiet remembrance rather than lively conversation. Elizabeth had outlived many of the people who had shaped her early life. Trusted advisers, childhood companions, noble friends and loyal servants had gradually disappeared as the decades passed. Occasionally a familiar name arose during dinner, and for a brief moment the Queen would pause before responding. Her expression often softened as she recalled someone who had served faithfully or played an important role in years gone by. The attendants nearby rarely interrupted these moments. They understood that even a monarch carried memories of loss, and the passage of time spared neither kings nor queens. The servants noticed that Elizabeth possessed remarkable self-discipline when faced with disappointing news. A messenger might arrive bearing reports of poor harvests, storms damaging ships, outbreaks of illness, or political unrest in distant parts of the kingdom. Although such information undoubtedly weighed heavily upon her, she seldom allowed emotion to overwhelm her during the meal. Instead, she quietly acknowledged the report, asked a few practical questions, and instructed that the matter be discussed more fully later with her counsellors. Only those who watched closely could detect the thoughtful silence that often followed, as the Queen considered the responsibilities awaiting her after dinner. No matter how comfortable the surroundings appeared, security never disappeared from the servants' minds. Every unfamiliar face entering the Queen's apartments attracted careful attention. Doors remained guarded, and only trusted officials handled the food and drink placed before Elizabeth. These precautions had become part of daily life after years of political conspiracies and religious tensions. To outsiders, such measures might have seemed excessive, but those serving at court understood how vulnerable a ruler could become during something as ordinary as a meal. The calm atmosphere surrounding the table existed only because countless precautions operated quietly behind the scenes. Occasionally, the Queen looked beyond the windows toward the palace gardens, especially during spring and early summer. Fresh green leaves, blooming flowers, and neatly trimmed paths offered a welcome contrast to the endless business of government. Gardeners worked diligently to keep these spaces beautiful throughout the year, knowing that the Queen enjoyed their appearance even if she only admired them from a distance. Servants sometimes followed her gaze and appreciated the same peaceful view, grateful for a brief reminder of the natural world beyond the palace walls. The changing light throughout the year altered the mood of every meal. During the longest summer evenings, daylight lingered well into supper, bathing the chamber in soft golden light before candles were needed. In the darkest weeks of winter, however, the meal unfolded almost entirely by firelight and candlelight, giving the room a more intimate atmosphere. Shadows danced across carved oak panels and richly woven tapestries, while polished silver reflected dozens of tiny flames. These seasonal differences became familiar landmarks in the servants' memories, marking another year in the long reign of their queen. The royal household also observed countless small traditions that rarely appeared in official records. Certain dishes were expected during important religious festivals. Particular wines accompanied specific occasions, and familiar recipes returned with each passing season. The servants anticipated these customs almost instinctively. Preparing the Queen's table became not merely a daily duty, but part of a yearly rhythm that connected one generation of household staff to the next. New attendants learned these traditions from experienced officers, preserving customs that had been followed for decades. Elizabeth's curiosity extended beyond politics and scholarship. She sometimes asked practical questions about the quality of the latest harvest, the condition of roads after heavy rain, or the success of gardens supplying the palace kitchens. Such inquiries reminded the servants that the Queen understood how deeply ordinary matters affected the well-being of her kingdom. Good harvests meant full markets and satisfied subjects. Poor weather could bring hardship to thousands. Even conversations that began with the vegetables served at dinner occasionally led to broader reflections about the health of the nation. Many attendants quietly admired the Queen's remarkable composure while waiting. Delays that might have frustrated others rarely seemed to trouble her greatly. If a dish required a few additional moments to prepare or a counsellor arrived later than expected, Elizabeth often used the time to continue conversation or simply reflect in silence. Years of ruling had taught her that impatience solved very few problems. This calm acceptance gradually influenced the atmosphere of the entire household, encouraging servants to perform their duties steadily rather than hurriedly. One detail that remained constant throughout her reign was the respect shown to experience. Older members of the household whose hair had grown grey while serving the crown often occupied positions of considerable trust. They understood the Queen's routines better than anyone and guided younger servants through the complexities of palace life. Elizabeth herself seemed to value this accumulated wisdom. Faithful service over many years mattered greatly to her, and those who remained dependable found themselves rewarded with lasting confidence rather than fleeting attention. Sometimes, after dinner had ended and most attendants had withdrawn, only a handful of trusted individuals remained in the chamber. The conversation became quieter still, touching upon literature, music, family memories, or events from earlier decades. These intimate discussions revealed a side of Elizabeth that few people beyond the palace ever witnessed. She spoke not only as England's sovereign, but as a woman who had experienced both remarkable success and profound personal sacrifice. The servants permitted to remain nearby recognized the privilege of witnessing these peaceful moments, understanding that history would remember only the public triumphs, while quietly forgetting the private evenings that shaped the person behind the crown. As midnight approached, and the palace finally settled into complete silence, the dining chamber stood empty once more. Chairs rested neatly beneath the table. Polished silver gleamed faintly in the moonlight, filtering through tall windows, and the last embers in the fireplace glowed softly before fading into darkness. There was little evidence that one of the most powerful women in Europe had spent the evening there. Yet for the servants who had prepared every plate, poured every cup, and observed every quiet conversation, the room held memories invisible to everyone else. Looking back across the decades, those faithful attendants would likely have agreed that the greatest lesson learned at Elizabeth's private table had very little to do with luxury. They had certainly seen magnificent jewels, priceless silver, rare foods, and elegant surroundings. But these were not the memories that remained strongest. Instead, they remembered discipline without harshness, authority without unnecessary cruelty, intelligence expressed through careful listening, and dignity maintained even in the smallest daily routines. They saw a ruler who understood that greatness was not achieved solely through dramatic victories or magnificent ceremonies, but through countless ordinary moments handled with patience, wisdom, and unwavering self-control. In the end, the Queen's private table served as a mirror of her reign itself. It was orderly without being cold, refined without becoming extravagant, and ceremonial without losing its human warmth. Every evening reflected the balance Elizabeth had spent a lifetime mastering. The balance between queen and woman, public symbol and private individual, supreme ruler and thoughtful human being. While the grand halls of England displayed her power for the world to admire, it was around her private table that her servants came to know the quieter qualities that sustained her through 44 extraordinary years on the throne. And it was those quiet qualities witnessed in the gentle glow of candlelight over countless ordinary suppers that remained etched most deeply in their memories long after the great Elizabethan age had passed into history. Even after serving the Queen for many years, some attendants admitted that they never entirely grew accustomed to her presence. There was something about Elizabeth that commanded attention without demanding it. When she entered the room, conversations naturally softened, backs straightened, and every servant instinctively became more alert. Yet this was not because she ruled through fear alone. It was the confidence she carried, the certainty with which she occupied every space, that left such a lasting impression. Those fortunate enough to witness her private meals often remarked that the Queen possessed the rare ability to make an ordinary evening feel quietly significant simply by being present. The Queen's long reign also meant that several generations of servants passed through her household. Some entered the palace as teenagers and eventually trained apprentices of their own before retiring after decades of service. These older attendants became living libraries of palace customs. They could recall how the Queen preferred her table arranged in earlier years, which dishes had gradually disappeared from fashion, and how certain ceremonies had changed over time. Around fireplaces after their duties were complete, they occasionally shared these memories with younger servants, preserving traditions that might otherwise have been forgotten. Through such quiet conversations, the daily life of the royal household was passed from one generation to the next. Elizabeth rarely appeared impatient with honest mistakes made by those still learning, provided they demonstrated genuine respect and effort. A nervous page who nearly stumbled while carrying a tray might expect severe punishment, only to discover that the Queen simply looked away, allowing the embarrassment to pass without further notice. Experienced servants understood the lesson immediately. The palace demanded excellence, but dignity could often be preserved by refusing to draw unnecessary attention to a minor error. Such moments earned Elizabeth quiet admiration from those who served closest to her. The Queen's private table also reflected the changing tastes of Renaissance Europe. New fashions in dining slowly reached England through merchants, diplomats, and noble visitors returning from abroad. Decorative ceramics, elegant glassware, refined table manners, and unfamiliar recipes gradually found their place within the royal household. Yet, Elizabeth never seemed eager to embrace novelty simply because it was fashionable. She preferred improvements that combined beauty with practicality. Servants noticed that while the appearance of the table evolved over the decades, its careful order remained remarkably constant. Every object used during the meal carried its own responsibility. Linen had to be washed until brilliantly white, despite the limitations of 16th century methods. Silver required constant polishing to prevent tarnish. Wooden furniture demanded regular care with oils and waxes to protect it from wear. Even the candles represented skilled craftsmanship, their clean burning beeswax carefully chosen to reduce smoke within the royal apartments. Behind every elegant evening stood countless hours of unseen labour, performed by people whose names rarely appeared in history, but whose work made the entire household function. The Queen occasionally showed curiosity about the lives of those who served her. While formal boundaries always remained firmly in place, Elizabeth sometimes asked after the family of a trusted officer, or expressed concern if she learned that a long-serving attendant had suffered illness or personal loss. Such inquiries were brief, yet they carried great meaning within the household. Servants remembered these moments for years because they revealed that the Queen noticed far more than many people assumed. In an age when strict social hierarchy governed nearly every relationship, even a few words of genuine concern from the sovereign could become one of the defining memories of a lifetime. Certain evenings were filled with anticipation before important events, preparations for a royal progress, the arrival of distinguished foreign guests, or celebrations following military successes often occupied much of the conversation during dinner. Maps might remain spread across nearby tables, letters from ambassadors waited to be answered, and lists of household arrangements required careful review. Although the meal itself remained orderly, everyone present sensed the growing excitement surrounding the days ahead. The servants understood that they too would soon play their part, ensuring the palace reflected the dignity expected of England's monarch. The palace itself seemed almost alive after sunset. Long corridors echoed softly beneath the footsteps of messengers carrying sealed documents from one office to another. Somewhere distant, a blacksmith might still be repairing equipment for the following day, while stable hands cared for horses that had carried riders across the countryside. Bakers prepared bread before dawn, laundresses continued their endless work, and guards quietly exchanged watches beneath the stars. The Queen's private supper represented only one small moment within the enormous daily effort required to sustain the royal household. Hundreds of people laboured while most of England slept, each contributing in some way to the smooth running of the monarchy. Servants often reflected upon the contrast between Elizabeth's richly embroidered portraits and the woman they actually knew. Official paintings showed impossible perfection, with elaborate gowns, dazzling pearls, symbolic globes, celestial imagery and expressions carefully designed to project eternal strength. Around her private table, however, they saw subtler details impossible to capture on canvas. They noticed the thoughtful pause before answering a difficult question, the quiet smile inspired by an amusing story, the slight weariness after a demanding day of audiences, and the genuine pleasure taken in a beautifully prepared meal shared among familiar companions. These were the moments no painter could fully preserve. As the Queen entered the final years of her reign, a deep sense of continuity settled over the household. Many of the routines surrounding the private table had remained virtually unchanged for decades. The same careful preparation, the same orderly service, the same respectful silence, and the same evening conversations continued despite the changing world outside the palace. England itself had transformed dramatically during Elizabeth's lifetime. Yet within the royal apartments, the familiar rhythm of supper provided a reassuring reminder that some traditions endured. For the servants who spent their lives attending the Queen, these evenings eventually blended into a tapestry of thousands of small memories, rather than a handful of dramatic occasions. They remembered the warmth of freshly baked bread on cold winter nights, the fragrance of roses drifting through open windows in June, the sparkle of candlelight reflected in polished goblets, and the gentle murmur of intelligent conversation continuing long after the final course had been cleared away. They remembered watching the greatest monarch of their age perform the simplest human act, sharing an evening meal with the same care, composure, and discipline that she brought to governing an entire kingdom. In later years, when younger generations asked what it had truly been like to serve Queen Elizabeth I so closely, the answer was unlikely to begin with stories of priceless jewels or magnificent feasts. Instead, they might speak of quieter things. The Queen's remarkable memory, her habit of listening before speaking, her appreciation for skilled workmanship, her calm acceptance of daily responsibilities, and the extraordinary dignity she carried into even the most ordinary moments. Around that private table, beneath the gentle glow of beeswax candles and surrounded by loyal attendants, the legend of Elizabeth Tudor became something far more enduring than royal spectacle. It became the story of a ruler whose greatness revealed itself not only in moments that changed history, but also in the countless peaceful evenings when, away from cheering crowds and ceremonial display, she simply sat down to dinner and reminded everyone present that true majesty often speaks most clearly in silence. One of the quieter responsibilities of the servants was ensuring that nothing distracted the Queen once she had begun her meal. Curtains were adjusted if the evening sun shone too brightly across the table. A smoking candle was quickly replaced before it filled the room with an unpleasant smell. If a draught slipped beneath a door and caused the flames to flicker, attendants moved discreetly to close it without interrupting the conversation. These tiny corrections happened almost invisibly, and Elizabeth rarely needed to ask. Years of observation had taught the household to anticipate her comfort before she spoke a single word. The greatest servants were those whose work passed completely unnoticed because everything appeared effortless. The Queen also appreciated punctuality. Dinner was not simply a matter of satisfying hunger, but an important part of the carefully ordered day. By the time Elizabeth reached her private table, dozens of officials had already coordinated their work so that every course arrived at the proper moment. Bakers had finished their loaves, gardeners had delivered fresh herbs, cooks had judged precisely when to remove roasting meats from the fire, and cupbearers had prepared the wine. A delay by one department affected everyone else. Watching this intricate cooperation reminded the servants that the royal household functioned almost like a small city, where hundreds of people depended upon one another to achieve perfection. Although Elizabeth ruled with unquestioned authority, she rarely filled every silence with conversation. There were evenings when she seemed content simply to observe. Her eyes wandered across the room, pausing on the glowing fire, the polished silver, or the darkening sky beyond the windows. Servants often wondered what occupied her thoughts during these quiet intervals. Perhaps she reflected upon letters received earlier that day, remembered a conversation with an old friend, or considered decisions awaiting her counsel the following morning. Whatever her thoughts, no one interrupted them unnecessarily. The silence itself became part of the rhythm of the meal. Occasionally, the Queen displayed a surprisingly practical sense of humour. If an overconfident courtier exaggerated his accomplishments, Elizabeth sometimes answered with a playful remark that gently exposed the boast without causing humiliation. Laughter spread carefully through the room, never loud enough to disturb the dignity of the occasion, but warm enough to remind everyone that wit remained one of the Queen's greatest strengths. Servants who witnessed these exchanges often smiled inwardly, though their expressions remained respectfully composed. The changing fashions of food also fascinated those serving the royal table. Recipes were copied by hand, exchanged between noble households, and occasionally improved by the talented cooks employed within the palace. A successful dish might remain popular for years, while another quietly disappeared after only a few attempts. Elizabeth herself seemed willing to sample new preparations, but she never allowed novelty alone to determine her preferences. If a simple roasted bird prepared with fresh herbs tasted better than an elaborate foreign recipe, she showed equal appreciation for both. Quality mattered more than unnecessary complexity. During periods when the court travelled on royal progresses through the English countryside, the servants faced an entirely different challenge. Temporary dining chambers had to be prepared within the great houses of loyal nobles hosting the Queen. Although these residences were often magnificent, they lacked the perfect familiarity of the royal palaces. Household officers carefully arranged the furniture, tableware, and ceremonial objects so that Elizabeth encountered surroundings as similar as possible to those she knew. To the servants, recreating the atmosphere of the Queen's private table in unfamiliar places became a remarkable demonstration of organisation and adaptability. Children of senior household officers occasionally caught brief glimpses of the royal apartments while visiting their parents. Though they were expected to behave with perfect manners, many could hardly conceal their amazement at the glittering silver, richly embroidered fabrics, and dignified atmosphere surrounding the Queen's meals. Older servants quietly remembered feeling exactly the same when they first entered the palace years before. Time and experience eventually transformed wonder into routine. Yet the magnificence of the setting never disappeared entirely. The Queen possessed a habit of acknowledging faithful service in subtle ways. She might remember the name of an officer who had served her for decades, or notice that a familiar attendant had returned after recovering from illness. These small recognitions required no grand ceremony, yet they strengthened loyalty throughout the household. Servants realized that while Elizabeth could not know every member of her enormous court personally, she made genuine efforts to recognize those whose dependable work supported her reign year after year. As the years advanced, the private dining chamber accumulated layers of memory invisible to visitors. Every chair had been occupied by trusted advisors whose counsel had shaped England's future. Every section of the table had witnessed conversations about exploration, diplomacy, literature, religion, and war. Every window had framed changing seasons through decades of triumphs and anxieties. The servants who remained in the household longest could almost measure their own lives by the countless evenings spent within that room. The polished wood, the familiar arrangement of candles, and the quiet rustle of linen became as familiar to them as the rooms of their own homes. Sometimes, after the final dishes had been removed, Elizabeth requested fresh fruit or a small sweet, while continuing an especially interesting discussion. The atmosphere relaxed slightly, though the dignity of the occasion never disappeared. Courtiers occasionally forgot they were speaking with the sovereign, and instead addressed her as an exceptionally intelligent companion in conversation. Yet the Queen's authority remained unmistakable. A single thoughtful question from Elizabeth often redirected the entire discussion, reminding everyone that behind her gentle curiosity stood one of Europe's most experienced rulers. The servants also observed how carefully the Queen balanced generosity with restraint. She rewarded loyal service, supported talented scholars and musicians, and encouraged skilled craftsmen. Yet she remained conscious of the financial responsibilities of the crown. Extravagance for its own sake held little appeal. Even at her private table, luxury existed within a framework of order and purpose. Fine food demonstrated the dignity of monarchy, but wastefulness did not. This balance impressed many of the household officers, who saw in the Queen's daily habits the same practical judgment that characterized much of her government. As darkness settled over the palace each evening, lanterns illuminated long galleries, while guards quietly continued their watch. Beyond the palace walls, London remained alive with taverns, markets closing for the night, church bells marking the hours, and ordinary families gathering around their own supper tables. The contrast could hardly have been greater, yet the servants sometimes reflected that both Queen and commoner ended the day in remarkably similar ways. They shared food, spoke with companions, reflected upon the day's events, and prepared for whatever tomorrow might bring. The difference lay not in the act of dining itself, but in the immense responsibilities waiting for Elizabeth once the meal had ended. Perhaps this was the greatest lesson her servants carried throughout their lives. They had entered the palace expecting to witness endless displays of royal magnificence, and indeed they saw treasures beyond imagination. They polished silver worth more than most families could earn in generations, carried dishes prepared from the finest ingredients available, and stood beneath ceilings decorated with extraordinary craftsmanship. Yet these outward signs of wealth gradually became less memorable than the Queen herself. What remained in their minds was her remarkable consistency day after day, year after year. Elizabeth approached the simplest routines with the same discipline, intelligence, patience, and quiet authority that she brought to the government of her kingdom. When the last surviving attendants looked back upon those peaceful evenings many years later, they likely realized they had witnessed something no portrait or official chronicle could fully capture. They had seen the moments between history's great events, the evenings when treaties had not yet been signed, battles had not yet been fought, and celebrations had not yet been proclaimed. Around the private table, illuminated by the warm glow of beeswax candles, and surrounded by loyal servants who knew every detail of the room, Queen Elizabeth, I revealed the qualities that sustained her remarkable reign: a calm mind, a disciplined spirit, an endless curiosity, and an unwavering commitment to the dignity of the crown. Those quiet suppers, repeated thousands of times across 44 extraordinary years, became the hidden foundation beneath one of the most celebrated reigns in English history. There were nights when the palace outside the Queen's apartment seemed unusually restless. Hooves echoed in the courtyards long after sunset as exhausted messengers arrived from distant counties. Their horses were coated with mud, their cloaks damp from rain, and the leather bags hanging from their shoulders carried letters sealed with wax from governors, noblemen, bishops, and military commanders. The servants at Elizabeth's private table often heard the distant commotion before anyone entered the dining chamber. A chamberlain might quietly approach the Queen, bow respectfully, and whisper that urgent correspondence had arrived. Elizabeth would nod almost imperceptibly, continuing her meal until the appropriate moment before asking for the letters to be brought. Those present admired her remarkable composure. She refused to let urgency descend into panic, believing that even troubling news deserved calm judgment rather than hurried emotion. Sometimes the letters contained encouraging reports. English ships had returned safely after dangerous voyages. Merchants described profitable trade, or local officials reported peaceful conditions in regions that had previously caused concern. On such evenings, the Queen's face relaxed ever so slightly. She rarely celebrated with dramatic displays of excitement, but the servants learned to recognize satisfaction in the gentle warmth of her expression. A conversation that had been serious only moments before might drift toward literature, music, or amusing stories from court life, allowing everyone in the room to breathe a little more easily. The Queen also possessed an extraordinary ability to remember details from previous meals. Weeks after tasting a particular variety of pear from a royal orchard, she might ask whether the remaining fruit had ripened equally well. She remembered recipes prepared by favoured cooks, and occasionally inquired whether a certain herb had come from Hampton Court, Greenwich, or another royal residence. Such observations astonished younger servants, who struggled to imagine how someone burdened with governing an entire kingdom could also remember the origin of a single basket of fruit. Yet Elizabeth's remarkable memory formed one of the qualities that made her such an effective ruler. The dining chamber itself gradually reflected the passage of countless seasons. Summer breezes occasionally carried the scent of freshly cut grass through open windows. Autumn brought the earthy aroma of damp leaves drifting in from palace gardens. During winter, frost decorated the outside of window panes, while blazing fireplaces filled the room with welcome warmth. In spring, birdsong could sometimes be heard faintly beyond the walls before evening settled across the palace. The servants experienced these seasonal changes year after year, until they became part of the rhythm of royal life, almost like another silent participant at the Queen's table. Elizabeth sometimes surprised those around her by asking questions that revealed genuine curiosity about ordinary life beyond the court. She wondered how harvests were progressing in different counties, whether recent storms had damaged villages, or how merchants described conditions in distant ports. These conversations reminded the servants that although the Queen lived surrounded by privilege, she understood that the prosperity of her kingdom depended upon farmers, craftsmen, sailors, and traders, whose lives differed greatly from her own. A loaf of bread placed upon her table represented months of labour stretching from the ploughed field to the village mill, and finally to the royal bakery. Among the most respected members of the household were those who had served Elizabeth almost since the beginning of her reign. Their hair had turned silver while carrying out the same quiet duties day after day. Younger attendants listened carefully whenever these veterans described how the Queen had changed over the decades. They spoke of the energetic young monarch who loved dancing, hunting, and lively conversation, and of the wiser older queen whose confidence had been strengthened by years of experience. Yet they always agreed upon one thing: her determination had never weakened. Whether young or old, Elizabeth approached every responsibility with unwavering seriousness. The servants occasionally noticed moments when the Queen seemed amused by the elaborate ceremonies surrounding her own meals. She fully understood the importance of royal tradition. Yet there were times when a slight smile suggested she recognized the extraordinary effort required simply to place dinner before one person. Dozens of attendants moved with perfect coordination. Precious silver gleamed beneath candlelight, and officials carefully observed ancient customs that had been repeated for generations. Elizabeth accepted these rituals because they upheld the dignity of the crown, but those closest to her sometimes sensed a quiet awareness that beneath all the ceremony remained a simple human necessity: the need to eat after a long day's work. The palace kitchens never truly slept. While the Queen finished supper, preparations for the following day's meals had already begun. Bakers measured flour before dawn, butchers inspected fresh meat, gardeners planned which vegetables would be harvested at first light, and brewers checked barrels stored in cool cellars. Servants returning empty platters to the kitchens found another shift of workers already busy cleaning, sharpening knives, kneading dough, and preparing ingredients. The enormous household functioned continuously, ensuring that every royal meal appeared effortless, despite the immense labor hidden behind it. One quiet tradition particularly impressed new attendants. Before valuable silverware disappeared into secure storage each night, responsible officers carefully counted every single piece allowed. Goblets, plates, serving spoons, salt cellars, and decorative vessels all passed through experienced hands before being locked away. Nothing was considered too small to record. The procedure reflected both the immense value of the royal collection and the disciplined organization expected throughout Elizabeth's household. Such careful accounting became another example of the order that governed every aspect of palace life. Occasionally, foreign visitors who had earned unusual favor received the rare privilege of joining the Queen for a more intimate meal. They often entered expecting overwhelming grandeur, but instead found an atmosphere marked by elegance, intelligence, and restraint. Rather than endless entertainment or extravagant indulgence, they encountered thoughtful conversation, carefully prepared food, and impeccable service. Many left deeply impressed, not because they had witnessed spectacular luxury, but because everything seemed so perfectly controlled. The servants took quiet pride in these reactions, knowing that their own discipline contributed to England's reputation abroad. As Elizabeth's reign approached its final years, there were evenings when the Queen appeared more reflective than before. She had outlived rivals who once threatened her throne, witnessed children grow into experienced statesmen, and seen England transformed from a vulnerable kingdom into a respected European power. During these quieter meals, the servant sometimes sensed that she was looking back across the extraordinary journey of her life. She rarely spoke openly about such thoughts, but her calm gaze lingering upon the fire or the gardens beyond the windows hinted at memories known only to herself. For the attendants who remained faithful until the end of her reign, the greatest privilege was not standing near priceless jewels or magnificent banquets. It was observing the consistency of a woman whose character rarely wavered despite decades of triumphs and trials. Every evening she approached the table with composure. Every conversation reflected careful thought. Every decision, however small, revealed the same disciplined mind that had guided England through one of its defining ages. They watched the Queen not only in moments of public glory, but also during the quiet hours when history paused long enough for her simply to share supper with trusted companions. When Elizabeth eventually passed from this world, many of those familiar dining rooms fell silent in a way they never had before. The chair at the head of the table stood empty. The familiar routines continued for a new monarch. Yet the servants who had devoted their lives to Elizabeth understood that an era had ended. They could still remember the gentle glow of candlelight upon her silver goblet, the measured sound of her voice discussing affairs of state between courses, the thoughtful pauses before answering difficult questions, and the calm dignity with which she concluded every evening. Those memories remained more vivid than any royal procession or public celebration, for in the quiet privacy of her supper table, witnessed only by loyal attendants whose duty was to observe without speaking, they had come to know not merely the Queen of England, but the remarkable woman whose wisdom, restraint, and steadfast spirit defined an age that would forever bear her name.